Um, I'm Jack Crowley. I'm the Director of Government Relations for the Planetary Society. I'm the eyes, ears, and voice of the organization in DC. But as you can tell, my voice is a bit shot after all the advocating we've been doing the last couple weeks regarding the budget. So if you can, if you have any questions, I know some folks submitted them beforehand, but we have the Q&A feature enabled. So if you have questions throughout, please throw them into there. You are able to send both Casey and myself messages via the chat, but the Q&A is going to be the best place if you have questions to submit them through there, just so that they're all in one place. Other than that, we can get started. Casey, do you have any items you want to address before we get started?
There's lots to talk about today, so why don't we just get right to it? Again, we'll have a brief summary of kind of our viewpoints on highlights of the budget, right? It's a almost 500-page document, so we won't address everything. A lot of stuff NASA has already put online at nasa.gov/budget, and so we'll take kind of our perspective and also, with our focus generally on science, exploration, and then do our best to answer questions that you have to submit coming in. So let's roll right into it, and we will get to your questions from there.
Great.
Okay,
Everyone can see my screen, right?
I can see it.
Great.
So we know what this is, so I think we can go to the next slide. Someone has come in. Yes, I have read all 500 pages. I can't say that I've can recall them on demand, but I do have them pulled up here. So yeah, so again, real quickly, for those of you who are somewhat unfamiliar, Planetary Society is an independent nonprofit organization. We're funded by members around the world, though primarily in the United States. Anyone can become a member, so we don't represent professional interests nominally. We don't have large aerospace industry as our donors, and we don't take government funding. So again, truly independent nonprofit. We do have things we care about, and we always like to lay out what we do care about in advance. Uh, Exploration, planetary and space science, and search for life, and things like planetary defense are going to be our core interests. So we're always going to take a particular interest in those, and this is what we fundamentally want to advocate and support from the space program. At the same time, though, because we're independent, we don't have any financial interest in any of these outcomes. And so that's relatively rare in Washington, D.C. So if we get what we want, ideally, through a policy sphere, we don't get anything more than just enjoying the great pictures that comes back with everyone else. So we always like to state that out. We think things we care about, but we don't have a financial interest in the ultimate outcome. We were founded, this is our 45th year, founded by Carl Sagan at a period of actually very big challenge to space science at NASA and planetary science specifically. And since 2011, Bill Nye has been our CEO. And one of the things we like to do as the Chief of Space Policy, but I guess I shouldn't introduce myself. I am Casey Dreier, the Chief of Space Policy for the Planetary Society, is to provide data and analysis and try to do that with as much dispassion and clarity and openness as we can in order to help not just us, but the full community make better decisions and be more aware about what is happening and what we'd like to see and what can be enabled in the future of space exploration, particularly through NASA. So, Jack, unless you want to add anything beyond that, we can move on to the next slide, which is an important one. Just to put this very clearly, we saw yesterday that the original briefing that was supposed to happen today from NASA's Science Mission Directorate was postponed. Jack and I run a very lean and quick shop here, so we figured this would be a great opportunity to share some of the briefing materials that we've been sharing, starting with Congress last week, and then also with Planetary Society members earlier this week, with a broader community. And ideally try to provide some insight and answers from what we know and through our analysis. But just to be really clear, this is not an official NASA briefing. We don't speak for NASA, and we are not informed by any NASA leadership right now. So this is a fully independent, this is what we've been sharing, and we'll do our best to, we can do math, we can look at numbers, and we've been doing this for a while. So we're happy to share with you what we know and to provide as much information because there hasn't, frankly, been a lot of information after this budget was released late on a Friday, almost 2 weeks ago. And so this is one way that we can try to provide some input from this. So, Jack, anything you want to add to this before we move on?
Nope, that's a great overview.
Okay, well, let's get right to it then. This NASA budget. Next slide. So, again, how do you summarize a 500-page budget? And so we tried to kind of step back and say, broadly, what is this going to do if this is enacted as proposed? And this is, again, I think we're trying to put this forth relatively dispassionately, but I think it's important to say things clearly that this budget is unprecedented in terms of the cuts that it proposes and in the radical nature of some of its shifts and pivots in the timeline that is being provided. It's not strategic in the sense that by doing so, it undermines its own goals in addition to causing a lot of pain throughout broader parts of the space community. And it's ultimately, as a consequence, wasteful, both in the sense that we believe this is very unlikely to succeed in the long run. And so it invests money in projects that won't continue. And it causes a lot of perfectly well-functioning projects, projects that are otherwise behaving well and on budget to either be canceled, to be shifted very rapidly, or given so little money that they're almost certain to run into problems and cost the taxpayer more. An example of this, of course, is the many active science projects that it aims to cancel, representing over $12 billion of US taxpayer investment that are still returning good data. Um, so I'll revisit this in a little more detail. Again, unprecedented. We'll go through charts that have the data to back this up. So this is not just opinion. These are radical cuts being proposed to NASA that would lower NASA's resources and when adjusted for inflation to levels not seen since before human spaceflight existed, not even just at the United States, but before Gagarin went into space. It's I'd say, a relatively radical shift in human spaceflight policy. It pertains to continue Artemis through Artemis 3. It loses a lot of detail about what happens after that, and then it starts putting a lot of initiatives towards Mars in a way that are in the budget not defined at all. And so it's unclear where those initiatives are coming from or if they will succeed and how they will succeed. It does propose radical cuts to other areas of NASA, notably science gets hit the worst, but also aeronautics technology, eliminates funding for STEM outreach and education, and cuts a third of NASA's remaining workforce. And I'd say also just important to note, it expands commercial partnerships, which aren't inherently bad, and Planetary Society generally supports those. But it does so in a way for markets that currently do not exist, and we don't know for, and certainly for capabilities that do not exist. So it does put the nation on a reliance structure for technologies and capabilities that are at best untested and at worst non-existent. Unstrategic then, as a product of, we believe this is budget first policymaking. From everything we understand, the budget was provided to NASA. NASA had very little, if any, input in this process. The budget is suspiciously similar to proposals made by the budget director, Russ Vought's personal opinions released in 2022, talking about reducing spending across the United States as an alternative to then Biden's budget, specifically calling for a 50% cut to NASA science. And this has a 47% cut to NASA science. A lot's happened in 3 years, but this didn't necessarily change the outcome of this budget process. So we believe this is a budget primarily as an output of the Office of Management and Budget and not a considered policy process. In doing so, it actually, again, undermines the president's unstated goals for spaceflight and landing a human on Mars. It divests from key technologies needed for that in this effort to do so. I think emphasizing that this was not a well-considered process or plan that led to this point. And it functionally does cede various parts of solar system and space science to other geopolitical rivals of the United States, notably China, which we'll highlight here later. And again, non-strategic in doing so, it breaks lots of partnerships with key US allies, notably a lot of joint projects with the European Space Agency. Wasteful then kind of comes out of that, right? In abandoning a lot of projects that are well behaving, abandoning a lot of projects that would be really important to maintain US leadership in space. And the wasteful, I think, importantly, is it's undermining the consensus that has defined the Artemis project since its creation. I find it fascinating in a sense that the first Trump administration had very good space policy and did a lot of the groundwork to ensure that when you hand off your space program to the subsequent administration, that baton will be carried forward. Artemis represented the first time in US history that a return to the moon program survived a presidential transition. And it's because they had done the work to create a coalition to sustain it. No work is being done right now to establish a new coalition for this Mars pivot. It is actively breaking parts of the coalition that have enabled Artemis to succeed so far. And so ultimately, it's going to be a wasteful exercise because we don't believe there'll be the political support necessary to continue these new initiatives forward while breaking the one that we did have. Again, we mentioned the cuts to science and existing projects, but also lots of cuts to fundamental technology and infrastructure. And again, the rapidity, the rapidness, the rapid nature of it, and the somewhat arbitrary nature inevitably will create waste through incoherence, frantic kind of implementation of broad policies, and of course, losing potentially key personnel and enabling capabilities and good in personnel and infrastructure in that process. So next slide, please. Okay, so again, just some broader context of NASA. Let's go next. Just always important to remind ourselves NASA's place in the federal budget. So of all U.S. spending, this is from last complete fiscal year 2024, U.S. spent $6.8 trillion. NASA was roughly 25 billion of that, less than 0.4%. NASA is not paid out of the full federal budget. It comes out of the discretionary non-defense chunk, which is a little over $1 trillion at that point, 1.5 trillion, and represent, I think, roughly 1.3% of that. So NASA's bucket, right, of spending comes out of what's roughly a sixth of overall spending of the United States. Discretionary, that means Congress approves or appropriates this funding every year. Non-discretionary, what's called mandatory in this chart, is stuff that is enabled by law. So a lot of it's primarily social programs, healthcare, interest on the national debt, and so forth. So again, it's a very, very small portion of overall spending. And so you cut a very small portion of a small amount of spending, you don't necessarily save anything, though you have serious consequences to the agency regardless. Jack, go ahead. Another way to visualize this is if every chunk in the federal budget was one NASA. NASA's one 270 seconds, 272 NASA's in the annual expenditures, and NASA is one, right? So it's a very small portion of overall spending. Go ahead, Jack. Also important, I think most of you who are attending this know this, but we try to emphasize this, that NASA is not monolithic internally. It's subdivided itself into directorates and program activities in other areas, where notably about less than a third is normally devoted to science, and roughly half, kind of bounces around over the years, is to human spaceflight, both in low Earth orbit and in deep space exploration efforts, the rest being kind of overhead salaries, infrastructure, technology, aeronautics, and then STEM is actually so small it doesn't even well plot in this chart, so we don't include it. It's less than 1%. These directorates don't share their budgets with each other, right? So you can have increases in one, cuts in other through distinct from the NASA overhead top line amount. So go ahead, Jack. I think I saw someone, yes, we will post these slides. So we'll make sure to share that out. Okay, big picture for 2026. So this is where we talk about the unprecedented nature, and we have the data that backs it up. This chart shows the relative percent change of a White House proposing its budget relative to the prior year's appropriation. So in this case, a 25% cut to NASA in 1 year is the largest single year cut ever proposed by a White House for the agency. And that includes in the years after Apollo, right? And so, which is notable, it's, they got number of, up to upwards of 10% cuts kind of annually after Apollo, which brought the budget down, roughly almost by half at that point. But no single year cut of 25%. So I think it's very notable that they're proposing a 25% cut, not while winding down a large lunar program, but while spinning one up and adding a very ambitious Humans to Mars program. Jack, in the next slide. So this is going to be then, if passed, this would be the smallest budget adjusted for inflation since 1961. Fiscal year 1961, which began in the summer of 1960, right? So well before the first human went into space. Very, very different NASA, of course, in 1960 and FY61 than the NASA we know today. It did a lot less. I think they had just selected the Mercury astronauts a few months before, right? So they had a very limited human spaceflight program, very limited. Apollo wasn't even a stated ambition at that point. So that's a dramatic shift in terms of absolute buying power. It's worth noting that this budget also fundamentally changes NASA's civil servant workforce. Cuts are implemented across every agency, every center, anywhere ranging from 20 to almost 50% at Goddard Space Flight Center. And again, if this is imposed, the workforce would be its smallest since fiscal year 1960, which again was actually summer of 1959. So this is a workforce. It proposes to reduce the workforce and available resources to levels not seen since the beginning of basically the dawn of spaceflight. And while directing NASA to pursue some of the most difficult projects that the agency has ever considered. This is where we say this is a relatively unstrategic process, the result likely of budget first policymaking. Next slide. The cuts are not uniform. Human exploration does see an increase of about 8% in this proposal, with 50% or 47% cut to science, 30-ish% cuts to space operations, which primarily impacts space station operations. SMS, that's the overhead of accounts of staff infrastructure cuts, are about 30%. 30% cut to aeronautics, about half cut to space technology mission directorate, and complete elimination of STEM outreach capability. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to just talk about really two areas briefly, and then we'll really open it up to questions. And so these are the two areas that we tend to care most about. We'll do again our best to answer and address questions beyond this. Exploration, again, I noted is 8.3 billion in this request. It's an increase of about 8%. Pretty dramatic changes. It proposes to retire SLS and Orion after Artemis 3. It moves to full kind of end-to-end coverage for commercial launches after that. Probably using the current human landing system contractors, Blue Origin and SpaceX. Cancels the Gateway Lunar Station, the upgrades obviously to SLS and related ground infrastructure to that. It moves about $1 billion towards this new Humans to Mars initiative, which would start a commercial Mars payload delivery services similar to what we've seen with CLIPS at the moon. It would procure a near-term test for entry, descent, and landing (EDL) at Mars for large human rated or kind of necessary to land human capability to land humans on Mars, which is bigger than what NASA has landed before in terms of just mass. It creates a Mars technology account that could invest in a lot of related necessary enabling technologies, about $350 million. Also starts a spacesuit, commercial procured spacesuit development program of $50 million, probably provided to the existing lunar spacesuit commercial contract at Axiom. And then beyond that, the details are relatively vague. And I include, again, kind of a quote that comes up a lot in this budget, which is, they will define content of this new program and will brief Congress as soon as appropriate. And I think that's a key aspect of this being non-strategic and also being, in a sense, probably wasteful in the sense that it's not clear exactly what this money is going to fund and whether it's enough or not enough, or the commercial partners, it's a similar amount necessary. They actually fund Mars payload delivery services lower than they've been funding lunar payload delivery services, which may or may not work for the commercial industry, but it seems like not much industry nor other folks were consulted on this before this was imposed. And I believe NASA is trying to figure out a lot of these things right now, but just does not have the details itself, does not have clear plans on a lot of these things. Next slide. So yes, you can kind of see the other kind of key aspect here is that a lot of the funding for a lot of the savings from SLS and Orion ending is not available until the run-out years. So you don't really start to see a lot of these Mars technology, Mars transportation systems, and future systems really kick up until nominally after Artemis 3. So if Artemis 3 is delayed, or if there are changes in administration or policy by this point, you actually don't see any of these new big investments happening. So this is, in a sense, most of these investments would happen after the current administration or the very end of this current administration. So that's a notable thing as well, right? There's a limited amount of money they put towards that based on the fact that what they pertain to cancel does not show up for years in terms of savings. And we can talk about already Republican members in the Senate have proposed bills to basically reject this proposal. Next. Oh yeah, and then I guess, again, kind of emphasis here that line after line, a lot of these programs are not well defined or defined at all. So next, Jack, please. Okay, so science. A lot of you here have seen and we've talked about this quite a bit at the Planetary Society. Again, a historic level of cuts leveled on NASA's science capabilities. Next slide. 47% cut, right? So that's a lot. We can say. We have additional charts on our website, but would bring science down in adjusted levels to its lowest point since 1984. That's before Earth science existed as a specific discipline. It was a much, much different era, obviously, of NASA in general. Um, but it's not just returning it; it's returning it from a point that had been relatively well. It had a recent local maxima in 2020 at the end of the first Trump administration at close to $9 billion, adjusted for inflation. Um, and as a consequence, right, there's a decimation of projects and capabilities. Um, as we predicted, in the sense, you just there's no room to continue operating a lot of missions. And from our initial count, we have at least 19 active missions. This chart here shows the number of years they've been running that are summarily canceled. These are independent of any senior review process. I believe the Planetary Science Senior Review came out yesterday or the day before, which endorsed things like Juno and New Horizons with very high scientific output. I believe astrophysics has recently undergone a senior review. I don't know if we have the details of that yet. But the point is, a lot of missions are canceled regardless of their scientific output. The flow of future missions drops precipitously with at least 20 project cancellations. I think at least 10 or a dozen, roughly, projects of US contributions with key allies are canceled as well. Um, Big projects like Mars sample return canceled outright. Happer Worlds for astrophysics is put into a hibernation state, not outright canceled at least. Um, Interestingly, I think, and related to this, huge reduction of science, functionally all science, both in terms of the science divisions, microgravity, and biological sciences program, but also just scientific activity funded on the International Space Station is removed as well, which I always think is kind of shocking because it's defined as a national lab, and what else are the astronauts going to do on the space station for the next 5 years? And you can, from all accounts, you read about astronauts on the station without science that kind of just fix broken things. They exist. It's almost becomes a teleological, self-fulfilling. You're in space just to be in space. And so science is one of those things that actually gives purpose to human spaceflight. And the fact that it's removed here, I think, is a not only a mistake, but I think fundamentally makes human spaceflight lack more objectives and capability. And I think that's reflected broadly in this budget, unfortunately. Um, Lots of consequences from these science cuts, obviously, to the community. In addition to this, not shown here, is very large reductions to fundamental science and research accounts that fund scientists, students, future scientists, engineers, technology development programs. A lot of them are canceled outright for smaller directed research programs. Most broad RNA programs for NASA sciences are cut anywhere from 65 to 30 to 20%, depending on the division. And so obviously that'll have some serious repercussions for the community that depends on these to continue existing. Um, Turns off a lot of space telescope. Again, astrophysics is uniquely hit in this. Jack, go ahead. Okay, here's those charts. You can see the four large mission uh, science divisions there on the right, showing the relative cuts adjusted for inflation. Planetary science down by a third, astrophysics down by 2/3, Earth science down to its lowest level, basically since it was created as an independent discipline, and heliophysics down roughly by half. So again, there's no way not to have substantial and broad consequences to these agencies, or divisions, I should say. Okay. For those of you who like sand charts, this was the fiscal year 25, what we're in now, as proposed by the last administration. This was their general run out projection for science. And if Jack goes one slide next, you can see this is the current run out for science. And so again, it's cut in half and maintained there. Those numbers are suspiciously flat in the sense that they're probably not, reflect that much of reality, but it's obviously you don't want to hang out at those levels for very long. Okay, next. And obviously this, like Dan say, like NASA science is a third of NASA spending. We tend to think of it, I think for a lot of us, as centered in Goddard or JPL or a few handful of centers, but NASA science is everywhere. It substantially impacts 3/4 of all congressional districts in the country, every state. We put data dashboards up using public data from USA Spending as a way to kind of track where NASA science is spent. And I think there's lots of interesting surprises particularly for, places like Eastern Iowa here doing heliophysics missions. You can see, obviously, Arizona has a large presence, but then places like Western Montana and Maine and others, they all have, and Western Oregon there. It's everywhere. And so there are, again, broad consequences to this, and this is broad consequences economically and also just from the relative ability of a lot of these universities, academic centers to retain, pull in, and train future scientific leaders and engineers in the country. Next slide. Another way to visualize this, a lot of you have seen. Jack, if you just step forward, here's kind of visually how to see the decimation going to the science fleet, unfortunately. So it's substantial. And even some things aren't fully pictured on here as well. So next slide. I think it's important to see this in context of geopolitical competition, particularly for the president who says that he wants space leadership and space dominance in space. That this budget, again, falling into the unstrategic category of our description, recedes and pulls back specific, almost precisely from the areas that China has announced it will be moving into. So this is the planned series for planetary science, primarily from China, released a few months ago. And you can see Mars sample return, missions to Jupiter. So Mars sample return, Tianwen-3, as our Mars sample return is canceled. Tianwen-4 at Jupiter as Juno is canceled. Earth-based platforms as Earth science is cut in half. Venus sample return as all Venus missions and Venus contributions are canceled. Mars Science Station, again, at the surface, and then Neptune as we kind of walk away from outer planet. I'll note also there's a lot of infrastructure cuts in terms of communications, nuclear thermal or nuclear propulsion, but also plutonium-238, which is an enabling resource to get out to places like Neptune and Uranus. And so again, even if we wanted to turn this around, if we lose these infrastructure capabilities, it's questionable whether we could even get out to Neptune anytime in the near future. So again, for the stated priorities of this administration, this budget is actually undermining those very priorities in the guise of trying to assert them. Next slide, please. We do have, obviously, from the Planetary Society's perspective, we think this is all bad. And we would like to see particularly NASA science back, but we want a healthier and rounded NASA overall. There's details about things that people can take action and lots of more resources with our charts, our raw data. You can also see detailed economic impact reports for every congressional district and state using that public data. And also just updates on what is happening at our Save NASA Science Action Hub. So I recommend people check that out as well. I think we have one more kind of summary slide, and then we'll start answering questions here. So again, I think this is, again, unstrategic, wasteful, and unprecedented. It's short-sighted in what it's doing. It again makes rapid pivots without thinking about the future, both in terms of canceling projects that are relevant to their stated needs. Again, infrastructure like plutonium, but also things like Mars telecom services like Maven, and obviously decimating the workforce that it will be ultimately needed to enable this. But again, absent consensus, this is a very divisive proposal that has not been made in much of an effort to engage either Congress or the American people with. And you need consensus in spaceflight. And this is not just my belief in this. This is the first Trump administration's belief, which was borne out as correct through their application of pursuing Artemis and creating the consensus for that, which again was the first successful transfer of a human return to the moon program for humans ever, with Apollo being the first going to the moon. But there's only 2 Mars launch windows in the next 4 years. We'll see maybe 2026 is a possibility, maybe something in 28, but then someone will have to launch in the 2030 window. Will that continue if there is a divisive and bitter set of destructive actions made through this process? I think it's unlikely. And I would even state it's unlikely even in a subsequent Republican administration, because there won't be a lot of base of support for this. There is also the broader threat, which we're very worried about creating Mars, or turning Mars into a partisan idea, which I think would be a tragedy. It's important maybe at this point to remind everyone the Planetary Society is really excited about Mars, and I love Mars, and I want to see humans go to Mars. Officially, the Society endorses humans to Mars, Moon to Mars program. And so we want this to succeed. And that's one of the reasons why we're so concerned about this anti-consensus budget. That absent this consensus, and if you create Mars as a partisan outcome, you will not succeed ultimately over time, because it will need to be a generational effort, sustained over time. And you do that by building a nonpartisan consensus. So this is, in a sense, it's a tragic budget in that this should be an opportunity to create consensus and should be an opportunity to build consensus and find an area of unity in an otherwise very divisive period. But instead, the cost and level of broad and rapid consequences that we're seeing from this in terms of science, aeronautics, space technology, um, I wouldn't say full abandonment of, but clear shifting of priorities away from the moon, breaking support with our key allies and partners, commercial partners as well. You start to see a very dim future for this rapid turn towards Mars. And so you've broken both the Artemis consensus and never established a subsequent Mars one. Um, Again, we've seen this also from Ted Cruz, a Republican who chairs the Senate's Commerce Committee, has already proposed an amendment to the budget reconciliation bill that would restore basically a lot of the projects this cuts in exploration. So it funds Artemis SLS rockets for Artemis 4 and 5. Gateway fully funds a bunch of other infrastructure that was otherwise cut in this budget. I don't know, Jack, have you seen a more rapid legislative response that fully rejects key tenets of a presidential budget request in history? I don't know if I have.
No, and so resoundingly, and from a member of the leadership of the
Yep.
president's party.
So I think that's already a sign that, and that's again the own party. So that doesn't mean this budget wouldn't be destructive, right? That doesn't mean that this won't move forward in certain ways. And I think there are opportunities to make advances in Mars exploration for humans. It should be a Moon to Mars program. But in the context of what this does, both to workforce, decimation of scientific activities, research technology, aeronautics, outreach, and STEM, uh, the division caused by that will always be then hung around the neck of any kind of future Mars activity and will be seen as paying that price for it. So that's ultimately, again, a self-defeating, self-negating project, and again, unstrategic. So that's our broad response to it. And at this point, Jack, should we start taking questions? Unless you have anything else you'd like to add.
No, that was great. We have quite a few questions in the Q&A. Remember, please send your questions through the Q&A feature. I do have the chat window open, but it's sometimes hard to track what's happening in the chat just because it's a smaller window. And so let's get to the first set of questions.
Should we deal with some of the ones that were submitted to the community board, the ones that we
Sure. I
can?
mean, we can start with one of those if you have one.
I think I pulled up a slide. So there's a lot of the questions on the community board are very focused on some of the scientific administrative stuff. And frankly, we just don't know the answer to a lot of them, right? Because we don't work in NASA right now and we don't know the deal of NASA. But one is about ROSES, which is one of the primary vehicle for submitting grant requests and proposals for NASA scientific research. And Jack, if you actually pull those slides back up,
Mhm.
I don't know what the answer is in terms of when the ROSES uh, call will come out for 2025. But we can show what was in this budget proposed, which was it said, I believe, June of 2025 is when roses would be released. So we're a third of the way through June. I think that was it's in a number of places, but I think it was on page PS-4 in the planetary science budget. So for what it's worth, this budget proposes that roses is going to be released sometime in June. Will that happen? I don't know. I certainly I think for the scientific community is really interested in when these are going to be coming out. So we don't have any more information than that, and that's where I hope NASA leadership is able to hold more information and provide more information as soon as possible for these types of questions from the community that we just don't know the answers to on the inside. Yep, there it is.
Yeah. So here's the cutout from
That's the reference
the
of
budget
that.
request.
So for what it's worth, that's the response in the budget released last almost 2 weeks ago. Um, so that's something to think about, but again, we don't know the detailed answer of it. Jack, what question would you like to answer next?
So maybe this is a bit of a softball question for us, but what are some ways to support the Planetary
That was a
Society?
real question. That was a real question. It was.
It was a real question. It's that first one that popped up for me. But Casey, I mean, do you want, I
Oh,
guess,
I mean, we'll just
I,
make a quick pitch. I mean, you can find on our website, where again, we're a member supported nonprofit. membership or donations are great. Just taking actions with our activities are great. Lots of ways that just sharing our information is great. I think that you're here is very positive. So I'll leave it at that. You can find out how to support us, but let's see if we can answer more on the budget itself.
Yeah, so we did get one question ahead of time that I think would be great. So do we have any insight into why the Senate Commerce Committee recommends adding $700 million to Planetary Science Division for a Mars telecommunications orbiter that would specifically support MSR in future missions, but did not recommend adding money back into the budget for MSR?
What would you say to that, Jack?
I mean, I would say so. This is in relation to the amendment that Chairman Cruz of the Commerce Committee submitted to the budget reconciliation bill. The Senate is passed the House. The Senate is currently considering and offering a number of amendments. Um, Chairman Cruz is very focused, with Johnson being based in his state, and having been a very strong advocate for the Artemis program and for the ISS. Very focused on human spaceflight, not necessarily focused on the science portion of the portfolio. What this bill will do, what this amendment to the bill would do, is create a supplemental $10 billion over the next few years that NASA can draw from for those specific projects. I see this as maybe probably a good thing because it allows you to have a little bit more flexibility with the rest of the portfolio. If exploration is not putting downward pressure on the funding towards science and space technology and space operations and all the other number in STEM education, the other things that NASA works on, that if exploration can kind of have their pot of money to draw from for these big projects, that creates a little bit more flexibility for the rest of the program. The mention of the telecommunications orbiter, right? So we have a number of orbiters right around Mars that provide telecommunications assistance to our assets on the surface. Specifically calling out this program, I think not mentioning MSR, I think MSR as a program has a little bit of a political bent to it right now. It's been going through a pretty rough period of time the past few years. And so I think focusing on the telecommunications infrastructure side, again, this is something that Chairman Cruz has been interested in, even dating all the way back to the launch of Maven back in 2013. Infrastructure is very important, right, for the chairman. And so making sure that the program has um, the human program and the robotic program have that telecommunications infrastructure in place, regardless of what the broad scope of the program looks like. I think is more his focus, and the fact that it also supports potential future crewed missions, whether that's in the next 2 years or in the next decade, is also of significant importance to him.
Yeah, again, all of the Mars Telecom stuff is strange and again somewhat self-contradictory in this budget, which is unfortunate because the budget at the same time proposes to cancel Maven, which is a science orbiter at Mars, but also has an Electra uh, uh, communications relay, which is basically a high-performant data relay capability for Mars. Its orbit has been changed over the last few years to be a better data relay orbit, and it was originally launched in 2014 during, or it was able to make its launch window because during a budget shutdown, a government shutdown, because it was considered infrastructure as a telecom orbiter to get to Mars to support ground assets. So that project, though, is canceled in this budget. So is Odyssey, which does serve as a relay, but a lot less. It's a much older project. And if those are canceled, you're left with MRO, which is a 21-year-old orbiter at Mars, and the newer one, which is the Trace Gas Orbiter, which interestingly would make the US almost fully dependent on its partners in the European Space Agency for ground communications with all of our remaining rovers, while also, pulling out of and a lot of other joint projects with European Space Agency. So I do not care really for how ESA is treated in this budget, unfortunately. Also pulling out of the Rosalind Franklin, their rover mission for the second time. NASA pulled out of it back in 2012. It's been a long and tortured history for that project. NASA had come back in after they broke their ties with Russia after they invaded Ukraine to finish this project, proposed to pull out again, while at the same time becoming more dependent on them for our assets. So there's a lot of stuff that doesn't make sense, and also that does propose a commercially procured Mars telecom system at Mars. It provides some money for that. It's one of those things that's not clear exactly what they're trying to build or how much they would actually need for that. Any next question?
Yeah. So next one is, In relation to I think what we've all been seeing on social media, related to NASA's archiving of their communications channels, how would this archiving of a number of major channels that NASA's been using affect the amount of data shown to the public from each mission?
Well, I think there's still support for the planetary data system. I mean, so in terms of data, I guess what do you mean by data? Images and so forth, it's hard to say.
Maybe updates about mission activity.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, I mean, the interesting thing, I think, certainly from our comms team here at the Planetary Society, we've realized how many people rarely at this point, particularly younger people, are not seeking out data. They receive it through platforms. And so the fewer social platforms you have, the fewer opportunities people can receive things, particularly ones that are focused on certain ideas. Now, obviously, there's still going to be the primary NASA social media accounts, and there's the data itself will still be PDS is fully supported in this, and other most other data archiving and resources are still supported in this budget. So the data would still be out there. It's really, I think, just how do you deal with the prioritization and mission specificity? And that's a harder question for me to answer, but I think that may be something to think about in terms of think about how people consume information now versus seeking it out is a difference there. And how much money do you save? I don't know. But we do know that I think this budget also does cut almost all outreach and press officers at every NASA center except for our headquarters, maybe a few
Yeah.
other places. So
And even the headquarters
centralizes
cut
quite
a
a
little
bit.
bit.
Yeah. A quick question here that's a slightly more technical one, but I think we can provide some response to, which is, do you have any insight into the future of Finest? Finest is a research program, future, what is it? Future, I see it here, investigations in NASA Earth and Space Science and Technology initiatives, funds graduate students and graduate student research. That is called out in the budget as a activity that continues. However, it is funded within the astrophysics RNA budget, which is cut by something like 60%. And so it doesn't break out any more details of that, but the pie that it has to draw from for support drops precipitously in this budget proposal. So it doesn't end. There just may be fewer opportunities for it from what we understand, again, from what is publicly put out in this budget. Jack, you want to choose the next one?
Yeah, let's see. Let's get a good one. Um,
They're all good questions,
they're
Jack.
all great
All
questions. I'm
great
trying to
questions.
create a narrative here too. Well, how do we get representatives of districts that don't receive direct funding understand the indirect benefits of space exploration, space
Sure.
technology development, and space science? This person's representative is very difficult to get a hold of.
I agree. Jack, you're our government relations person. You engage with folks like this all the time. How do you approach that, and what would you recommend for people?
Yeah. So first I would go to our NASA science spending dashboard. Um, Not sure if the district that is mentioned, which I will keep anonymous at the moment, if that district is one of the ones of the 377 that do receive NASA science funding. You can always, of course, if your district doesn't receive that direct funding, you can get a good sense of the indirect spending by looking at the statewide NASA spending or NASA science spending in that particular state. Um, what I would recommend is congressional staff are very busy people, right? We're all very busy people. Um, the more you can provide them information about the work it is that you do, the work that you are helping support, the impact that it has in your community, they're not going to know those things unless they hear from you. And so even if it is you sending what it feels like sending your information into the void, going onto one of those contact forms or going to planetary.org/action and using one of our pre-populated messages to contact your legislators directly, you can guarantee that that information is getting to the right people. You might not get a response right away. Members of Congress, their offices can receive upwards of 16,000 messages every day. But yours might be the only one related to space. Remember that. And so you can help define that issue for that constituent or for that caseworker or for that congressional staffer. And you would be surprised, and I see this all the time, members of Congress that go and meet with their staff and they say, well, I'm in a district that doesn't have a NASA center. We don't have a major facility. what do we have to do with space? And you show them the economic impact report, or you talk about some of the research or the scientists that are located in that district, and they're blown away that this is not a Maryland and California endeavor, but space science is a 50-state endeavor. Every state has at least an institution, and in most cases, multiple institutions that provide support, provide research, analysis, mission teams, as part of the NASA Science Mission Directorate. And so having that conversation is very important, even just that introductory, and make sure that you're talking in those broad strokes, because this
Yeah.
congressional staffer, over caffeinated, underpaid 20 something, might not necessarily understand the broad scope of what NASA does. One of the biggest questions, and I get this from congressional staff as much as we get it from the public, is, well, what has NASA done since Apollo? It's like, what has NASA done? It's an amazing, right? I mean, we saw the fleet chart, 120 missions in development
Onto
now,
every major body in the solar system
to
since.
every major body in the
Yeah.
solar system, being able to tell that. So we need to be able to tell that story in those broad strokes, and then be able to delve into like the further specifics about the particular programs that we care about, or the particular missions that we're a part of. But you'd be surprised in the lack of information that is available to these folks. And they'll only get that information if you contact them. So
Yeah.
again, planetary.org/action is the best place to go, to get those pre-populated messages to send directly to the
Yeah.
members of Congress and their staff, that represent you in Congress. And they're receptive. That's the thing. Space is something that's nonpartisan, broadly supported by the general public, broadly supported in the Congress. They just need to know that they have a constituent, or that they have a neighbor that is involved in this endeavor that is so exciting, and that can really capture their enthusiasm and interest. And you'd be surprised at the result that you'll see.
And then, I mean, I'll even just add to that too, a kind of a broader strategic. We do have an online Space Advocacy 101 course on our member community here at the Planetary Society that kind of goes into strategy and communication strategy for engaging Congress. On top of that, I'll just very quickly toss in one of those things also is thinking about what their priorities are, and if you can find a way to take one of your priorities and slot it into their structure of what they care about, right? So are they interested in geopolitical competition? Are they interested in U.S. preeminence? Are they interested in U.S. space leadership, industrial base? Members of Congress really interested in mentorship or education, maybe worried about STEM cuts and so forth. So can you find like where they care about, and then in the ways that science or NASA itself engages, and slot that in, I think is also a good strategy to think about. I wanted to follow up here with a question on Venus. And then we have a number of questions. I'll kind of like merge a couple of them together about, so Veritas and Da Vinci were two Discovery class missions selected 2021, 2020, and have been pretty much strung along. They've barely gotten off the ground in terms of development, and both are proposed as canceled in this project, in this budget, in addition to the U.S. contribution to European mission Envision, which is providing a radar. And also, I should say, all Venus technology. So Venus itself is almost excised completely out of this budget. And it's one of the questions is, how will NASA recover the science? I mean, in this budget, there is no recovering that science, right? There may be ways that individual grants can be applied going forward, but again, that's a NASA administrative decision that we don't know. But as this, it's just reading the plain language of this budget, this is the end of NASA's return to Venus, and it kind of before it started, which is again kind of a tragedy with it. So that's a major loss, I think, out of this one, Jack. I think the end, you said you have the number, right? The last time we were at the end of Magellan, the last time NASA had a Venus mission was 94 is when that ended.
1994. October, I want to say October the 13th was around the time that it deorbited.
Yeah.
So more than 30 years. And then in the case of something like Da Vinci, it's been more than 50 years that we've actually had something enter Venus's atmosphere.
Hmm.
So both of those missions, plus the Envision contribution, Vensar, as well as the Venus technology line, which is supposed to set up, as aligned with the decadal surveys, supposed to set up a long-term plan for Venus exploration within the Planetary Science Division. Completely, they turn off that spigot in this budget request.
Yeah. Kind of similarly, there's a question about what the future for Viper is. Viper in this budget request is canceled. And they do make clarity that the team funding for Viper out of the Discovery line will end in fiscal year 2025, at the end of 2025. So not a bright future for Viper either. And we did see NASA recently pull the analysis, or kind of the pursuit of commercial partners looking to land it. I don't know the story behind this, but it does show a dim future for Viper in this broader context as well, which again, I think is functionally a built and ready to go mission. I still don't know why they don't throw it on the human landing system demonstration that we are paying for with SpaceX here in a couple of years, but maybe that's something people smarter than I can figure out. Um, Again, so that's the essence of it. I hope there is a future for Viper. Just to be clear, the Planetary Society was very supportive of that last year when it was first delayed. And again, that project just got a raw deal in that it was the project itself was great. It was great shape. It was ready to go, and it was the delivery platform that was not there for it. You want to choose the next one, Jack?
Yeah, so we actually have a great question. Do your workforce numbers take into account FTE loss due to specific mission cuts? Be a good where do those FTE numbers come from?
FTE comes from the reported civil servant main civil. I mean, they may be somewhat related. Those are reported at the end of the fiscal year 2026 budget about the kind of proposed staffing levels for each NASA center. That's at the end of I don't know if it's not necessarily in the appendix, but it's in some of the supplementary materials of the congressional budget justification. A lot of FTEs for these projects are not civil servants; they are contractors, and so this does not include contractors. And that's an interesting question of how that will shift, notably because a lot of just more contractors will be involved with some of the commercial shift, but in different ways through kind of these commercial partnership models. So no, we don't have those numbers yet. Any economists who want to help us figure that out, I welcome you contacting us. We are taking volunteers to help on some of this data analysis that we can provide. I did want to, Jack, throw a question to you that I think is maybe just worth emphasizing here. Someone is asking, what is the difference between a president's budget request and a final enacted budget? And let's just emphasize and this kind of relates into next steps here, what happens next.
Yeah. No, so that's a great question. That's the $24 billion question, right? Or 18.8, depending on which number you're going with. So the president's budget request, well, the thing that we're talking about, right? This thing that has the 500 pages, we had received or the administration had released what's called the skinny budget, which is the just overall top lines, the bare bones. Some people refer to it as the budget request. It contains functionally no actionable information. So that's why we call it the skinny budget, was released at the beginning of May. That is merely the opening salvo from the administration saying, here is where our priorities lie. It is in large part more a messaging document than actual budgetary text, seeing as how, according to Article 1 of the Constitution, Congress is the one in charge of allocating and appropriating funds as part of the annual appropriations process. And so that final enacted budget is crafted exclusively by Congress with the input of, okay, we have the president's budget request. OMB theoretically is supposed to work with the agencies, though, as we are generally aware, NASA was not really consulted on their own budget request. Notionally, this is supposed to represent a consensus of the federal government going to Congress saying, here's where our priorities lie. And Congress is supposed to take that and compare that to the previously enacted budget for that full year. Or to, in the case that we're in now, the previously enacted budget from 2 years ago, because we're operating under what's called a continuing resolution, which just means fiscal year 2024 funding is remaining flat for all of FY 2025. That final bill is supposed to be passed by September 30th, the end of the federal fiscal year. Congress has not passed a full year appropriation for all 12 sections of discretionary spending since 1997. So you can guarantee that at least for the first part of this next fiscal year, we'll have a continuing resolution for a period of time before they enact what's called that full year appropriation. And that's what includes all of those top line numbers. That is the thou shalt spend X number of dollars on these broad programs. I will note there is some confusing nomenclature being used. So the budget bill that we're often talking about, this budget reconciliation bill that's currently being reviewed by the Senate, is not the annual appropriation. That is the large, big picture 10-year run out of federal spending. It addresses things like the tax code. It addresses things like revenue and
Mandatory
expenses,
spending. Yep.
mandatory spending, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. That is in very broad strokes. And what we saw from Chairman Cruz, for example, that supplemental 10 billion, that is but a section of that much larger piece of legislation. And again, as I said, it's $10 billion over the course of many years. In an annual appropriation, you are talking about only from October 1 to September 30th of the following year. And so Congress, that is what governs the like actual program level spending for NASA. And so NASA will get that amount of that information, ideally by September 30th, but likely sometime at the end of this year, and be able to develop what's called the spend plan, which is based off of that input from Congress saying, here is how much you need to spend. NASA will say, okay, based on the priorities laid out in that legislation, based on the priorities laid out in budget hearings and conversations with the appropriators in Congress, here is how we are going to spend that money wisely to meet all of these needs from across the community. And that's where things like the decadal surveys come in, which do hold, there was one question we got earlier was about sort of the value of the decadal surveys, still upheld very highly by members of both Republican and Democratic members, members of the appropriations authorizing committees. The decadal surveys really are those for the Science Mission Directorate, really that guiding light for the programs. Despite the current budgetary environment, that is those consensus documents for all of the 5 science divisions and are still referred to even in these tough fiscal times.
Yeah. Now, I think we should add that there's a rub this time around to this process. That is, and again, this is becoming it unfortunately technical, but it's very germane to this discussion, particularly again if you are involved or invested in a NASA mission, particularly in the sciences side, but any potentially canceled or defunded one. Which is that, again, the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, is responsible for doling out appropriated money. And the director of OMB right now, Russ Vought, has a very, let's say, muscular opinion about what the role of the executive is in that process. This is this idea of impoundment, which is that the president is not compelled to spend every dollar that is appropriated if he does not want to. That is, I believe, in my opinion, a relatively radical idea that is probably going to be, is in sense being tested right now, will almost certainly result in a Supreme Court hearing about this. And that will be, that's obviously a much bigger issue to deal with. But if Congress provides money and then the administration declines to spend it, that is a very, very different world that we live in this country in terms of how the politics around this works. But even pending that, we are seeing, and this is reporting coming out from Politico E&E just the other day, that, and this is something that we're worried about now, which is that the OMB may move to implement some of the proposed cuts or rescissions in this current fiscal year, 2025, before Congress has an opportunity to weigh in on 2026. There's a number of technical strategies that they may be deploying here, but just reading from this article, it does identify more than $100 million in science spending at NASA is identified as being functionally rescinded at what would be, I think, paused or a pocket rescission. Is that what the term was, Jack?
Yeah, basically running out the clock
Running out the clock in time. Yeah. So
on the
delaying spending it. And there's some, again, it's possible maybe to do that this time around because we're operating under a full year continuing resolution. Congress did not actually technically provide appropriations this year, and there's a number of technical challenges to it. Again, this is all happening very cloak and dagger, unfortunately. This article goes on to report that a lot of these discussions are happening over the phone with no written record. And we don't have information about what that $100 million pertains to. So obviously, yes, we're very concerned about this hitting faster, of winding down projects this year before we have the opportunity, or right at the beginning of the fiscal year if there's a continuing resolution. The other rub, which is more common and less unusual or ahistoric, which is during a period of a continuing resolution, a partial continuing resolution. So that Jack said we may be in, almost certainly likely to be in here at October 1st. The OMB classically has throttled down the rate of spending to be commensurate with generally the lowest of all possible budget scenarios. This is not unique to the current administration. This happened under Obama and George W. Bush and others, in the sense that because the US cannot spend unappropriated dollars, you don't want to spend at a higher rate and then find out that Congress has cut your budget and then you're caught with your pants down, metaphorically speaking, in budget parlance. And so it may be the case that absent rapid congressional directives or specific directives in the CR that a number of these cuts will be functionally imposed in the fiscal year during a point where Congress has not been able to weigh in. And as many of you know, you can't really turn off and on a mission again. You can't lay people off and immediately get them back. You could have a lot of consequences from this period of uncertainty. So that is something obviously we've been communicating with members of Congress. And if we do find ourselves in a continuing resolution scenario, that we need specific directives saying that you cannot do that, that you cannot end missions. Jack, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, well, the first thing I'll say is I know it's 11 o'clock. Well, I guess 11 o'clock right where I am. So end of the hour that we had scheduled. If you have to leave, don't worry about it. Thank you for joining us. We're going to follow up with an email with the link to the slides, as well as the full recording after we're done taking questions, as well as a link to our Action Hub. So please, thank you for participating in this. And so, don't worry if you need to head out. Oh, Casey, you're muted.
Oh, I can't. But we're going to answer more questions because I think we got lots to talk about still. I think are you good for a little bit longer, Jack?
I am. I think I'm
Okay.
supposed to check out of this hotel room at some point, but we'll
Okay. We'll
see.
let them drag you out. Damn it. You're
They'll
going to be
drag
asking
me out.
questions about the budget here. Um, but yeah,
But
no,
no,
I'm
the thing I just wanted to add to
yeah.
what you were saying, Casey, is yeah, with both the continuing resolution and the full year appropriations, right? I think there's some stipulations that can be made that Congress has made before, that there is legal precedent for Congress being very clear that what they're asking the administration to spend is not a ceiling, but a recommended level, that they should spend up to or no less than a certain amount. So all of that, thou shall language that you see in legislative text has a lot of purpose. And so there are avenues that we are advocating for as part of this process to make sure that NASA has the resources that it needs, even in the event of a continuing resolution or in a strange situation in which the administration is overstepping the precedent and previously set legal bounds.
Okay. So again, that's we will send this link out. It's not on the standard Politico site. We'll send this out in the email and we'll add it to these slides as well as a reference for those of you who want to see this. Here's a question here I want to follow up on is what can schools do, especially students, to get more visibility into the elimination of STEM outreach? This is not, I guess, NASA's, I think in 2017, they proposed to cancel all STEM before. It's been proposed to be cut before. But there's particularly one program that is universally beloved, which is Space Grant. Every American state and territory has a Space Grant office. So it literally impacts every state. And these are modest, right? I think, top of my head, it's roughly 50 million for this. So it's roughly a million-ish dollars per state per year. But what that goes to, it supports rocket clubs. It enables some like student summer internships. You're spending single-digit thousands of dollars in most of these programs. And so you can do quite a bit doling out $1 million a year. That's one of those things that NASA does that touches literally every state. It's a very feel-good thing. So I think going to your state and looking up your state's space grant office as an example of what they do, and then taking that to your member of Congress or just elevating it, or even having members of who's been of those student groups collectively write or share their stories, bring it to your local newspaper or post it on your local subreddit or other online news source. I think a big general piece of strategy we've been telling people is to just make this local. There's NASA's everywhere. And if you can make this about not just a spacecraft a billion miles away from the sun, make it about the uh, researcher next door who works with students in your community, teaching them about Venus, or about the rocket club that in your school that gives kids like a chance to become, participate in something exciting or give them a joy for something that is fundamentally important, but also unique in what we do. So finding ways to connect this and STEM and Space Grant is a fantastic way to do that.
Yeah. I mean, I will say it can seem scary to reach out to your member of Congress. Um, it's they're 500 miles, 1,000 miles away from some of you, or right down the street if you're like me and live in Virginia. Um, it can seem scary, especially if you haven't done that before. But just know that they're they're people just like us, right? These are people that not just the elected official, but the staff who have dedicated their lives to public service. Um, you can kind of discount what you see on TV as the characters they play. In reality, these are people that want to hear from you, that want to hear about the impacts of these programs. And I see there's a question in here. Do you think Congress will reject the bill? I mean, this bill, this is, I won't even call it a bill because it's merely just the request, is so poorly thought out and so poorly constructed. We've seen not just from the expected sort of induced opposition from the Democratic caucus in the House and Senate, but even the Republican conference in the Congress have been lukewarm at best to this. Just look at some of the public statements from Chairman Tom Cole or Chairman Brian Babin of the Appropriations and Authorizing Science Committee in the House. This is, and look at Chairman Cruz responding with his amendment to the reconciliation bill. I've heard privately from staff from high-ranking members' offices that this request is dead on arrival. But that just means that they need to hear from you. Your member needs to hear from you that this is going to have a direct impact on their community. And they, again, they're elected, whether you voted for them or not, they are elected to represent you. And their job, and a lot of them take this with a lot of pride, is to be that voice for their community in Congress. And so giving them that ammunition, giving them the information about what is happening in the district and in the state that benefits science, that benefits space exploration, but also benefits that locality is incredibly important. So if you can write an op-ed, if you can send that letter, if you can give them that call, you will be, again, be very surprised at the positive reception that you'll receive. So
Someone is just asking, but didn't this budget already pass the House? Again, this is part of that. The parlance of this is all really bad right now. That's the unrelated, pretty much, well, it's somewhat related, but it's not the appropriations. That's the budget reconciliation process that Jack was talking about earlier. That is the overall mandatory spending limits, taxation bill. Different than this, generally what we're talking about. Now, it can be related if it sets spending limits or allocation limits on the pool of money that committees have to draw from to fund NASA. Or if Ted Cruz's amendment gets through in the final bill, if it passes, that provides funding for some of these human spaceflight projects that could offset the pressure on appropriators to backfill NASA science. But fundamentally, that's a very different process. So we're talking about generally a different process at this point. It is not too late. In fact, I think the first hearings on this budget are scheduled now for July for appropriators.
yeah, so the House will have their hearings on the NASA. Well, it's called the CJS, Commerce, Justice, Science. It's the pot of money that includes NASA. NASA's about 30% of that overall allocation. But that hearing is set for July 7th in the House. The Senate has not set their hearing date, will likely be in the latter part of July. But right now is that period of time in which appropriators are going through the budget request and going through the input from outside organizations like the Planetary Society to determine what that best path forward is. And the one thing I will note, so we throw around a lot of nomenclature here, but the 302Bs, an important term to remember if you're going to get into space or into policy in writ large, the allocation to each of those appropriations is broken up into those 12 subcommittees. CJS, which covers NASA, is one of those. So the allocation for all of those is not yet public, but we have interim allocations for 4 of the 12. And I did the analysis yesterday. All 4 of them are approximately the same amount. CJS was not one of them, but for all 4 of them, it's approximately the same amount as in FY 2024. So which just goes to show that even in the Appropriations Committee, even in the Republican-controlled House, they are not taking this budget request seriously for other parts of the federal government and are actually increasing the investment in things like agriculture, which does get hit pretty hard by the president's budget request. So in other parts of the federal government, they've already run into some headwinds. So be part of that headwind, be part of that resistance to
Yeah.
this disastrous budget request and contact your legislators today.
A related question that's worth mentioning here is if their member of Congress already supports NASA, what do you do? And we've had that. I mean, that's great. I think first you say thank you, and then you say, tell me your plan. So press them on it. So I mean, that's the issue here, is kind of Jack was alluding to. there is kind of an omni crisis that is facing a lot of parts of government and obviously government funded activities. And the challenge is making sure that we are not lost in the, broader issues, right? So you're having cuts to NIH, you're having cuts to NSF, you're having cuts to public broadcasting or agriculture, as Jack was saying. So you need to make sure that even if people support NASA and support NASA science, that they need to make it a priority, that they need to keep the focus on it. And so even if you get a response saying, hey, I already support you, you say, great, tell me your plan about how you make sure this doesn't happen and tell me how we can help. So press for details, press for, you expect to hear how they will do it. And if they demur on it, then you know that they're not that serious. And it's an opportunity to say, do you really support this or not? So I would really focus on that.
And
Um,
and if they ask you for your input, encourage them to join the Planetary Science Caucus, the only bipartisan, bicameral organization within the U.S. Congress dedicated to advancing space science research and exploration.
yes. Someone here saying that we should put these key takeaways in the New York Times or Washington Post op-ed. I'll take this opportunity. I did have a New York Times op-ed the other month talking about the broader potential implications of this. Maybe the Post would like to hear about the details of these takeaways. But yes, we're working on getting the word out. And I'd say also, the key takeaways: unprecedented, unstrategic, and wasteful. Um, Take these forward. I think it's very important that we talk about this again plainly. Again, we have the data to back this up. These are the dispassionate ways of framing this budget. And again, crucially for the administration, this budget undermines their own goals. So even if you want to, if you disagree that science needs to be the priority at NASA, or you disagree the moon should be the priority, the way that this budget is being rolled out and provided and proposed and implemented is self-defeating. So even from that perspective, this is a bad budget process and needs to be talked about like that. So there are ways to make this a consensus budget. And I think, again, the worst outcome we could have is having NASA become another partisan institution, or what NASA does be partisan. It does not have to be that. And I'll emphasize again that the society loves sending the idea of sending humans to Mars, and I want to support that. This is why I think this is dangerous, that we're creating the disunity around it under this guise of doing this, because this is not the way to make this work. Question here, will NASA pursue a mission to Uranus? Not in this budget. There is no support for that, and particularly if there's not any plutonium-238, which we need to operate out. So that's the other aspect, again, shutting down things like plutonium-238 production, lock the US into certain distances from the sun. You cannot go out to those outer planets. So another short-sighted decision that is not, you basically cede that to whomever else has that capability, or you just give up on it, right? So this is another way of, like, this budget is also a narrowing of ambition. It's giving up and abandoning a lot of US capability and research, right? Right? It's the opposite again of things that the administration itself states they want to do, which is why it's important that we talk about it in this context.
Yeah.
Um,
I'll just add to that
mhm,
even in the last administration, the Biden administration's last budget request, they did include notional start dates for a Uranus mission in the 2027 timeframe, fiscal year 2027 timeframe, which begins October 1st next year. And so obviously not their budget. They didn't pass a budget for fiscal year 25. We're still a year out from discussions on fiscal year 27. But even under that last administration, but in this budget request for the second Trump administration, not a single mention of new outer planets missions,
yeah,
which is a real disappointment, seeing as how, again, these documents are supposed to be forward-looking, looking not just at the next fiscal year, but what are we setting up for years after? And
yeah,
this is, again, very, very narrow-sighted of
yeah.
a budget.
Question here, if projects that get canceled, they be restarted? Yeah. Some of them, right? I mean, if you lose an in-flight mission like New Horizons, which is out in the Kuiper Belt, you don't probably get that project back. Maybe you can, I mean, depending on what NASA does in some of these short shutdowns, they're able to do orderly shutdowns if these projects have to go. Maybe you can put them into deep sleep or hibernation. You can't always guarantee that you can bring them back, but theoretically, and there have been examples of this over time. Um, and you could always start a new development project. It's just how far back that sets you. What's your workforce look like? What's your knowledge loss? And then there are some things again, just talking about Uranus, some of the orbital dynamics, you won't get chances at these again for certain, based on distance or lighting conditions or various aspects of their orbits. it becomes very difficult to do anytime soon. So there's always a chance, and I think that's important here too, that you know, from the Planetary Society's perspective, like this is not a one and done fight, right? That this is something that we will be committed to for as long as it takes. And if some of these cuts ultimately happen, because as Jack said, there's a lot of just structural challenges this year to pushing back on this. Well, then damn it, we'll just push to rebuild it, and it'll take longer. It'll have been a wasteful exercise. It will have caused a lot of unnecessary suffering and self damage to our nation and national standing and national workforce and capability. But I'm ultimately anyone who works in space is an optimist, right? You always, if for nothing else, you have to be confident and hope that you will be around in 8 months whenever you send your spacecraft to that empty point of space, that there'll be a planet there at the right time and that you've done the math that works, right? You have to be optimist in this. And we will push to just, we can rebuild things back. It's just how much waste and delayed time you want to have in that, right? So it's easier to not do that. And that's what we're really arguing to do right now. Okay.
There's a great question in here. We already kind of talked about the Mars missions, but let's talk a little bit more about, can you please also mention how canceling active Mars missions will affect ability to communicate? It's a good
Yeah.
question, especially as we have the budget request, which focuses on a crewed mission
Yeah.
as the ultimate goal for the human program.
So I wrote a paper about this, or a white paper about this a few years ago. I think it's still relevant. Looking at so every Mars thing on the ground, if you particularly rovers, you don't have a ton of extra mass or space to have a giant antenna to talk back to Earth, right? And so you have these very tiny little antennas that can basically talk to a spacecraft as they're orbiting overhead. That spacecraft relays the data back. These spacecraft have a lot more power. They have much bigger antennas and dishes that, at much higher data rates. You can talk to something on the surface of Mars, but you're talking about early 1990s era download speeds versus hundreds of megabits a second that you can get from some of these more advanced, or at least through the communication, then megabits per second coming back to some of these more satellite relay services. So we've had, again, every orbiting spacecraft NASA's put into to Mars has had a certain type of communications package to enable this type of rapid communication. And again, yes, Maven is canceled in this, which is one of the more capable ones, and then Mars Odyssey, which is an older one, but still capable of doing some relay. And leaves it basically down to two spacecraft, again, with one of them being an ESA-led, European Space Agency-led mission with a US communications package on it. So you want to send astronauts, your data needs are much more massive, right? And I always think of communications, it's one of those things you don't think about how important it is because we just take it all for granted that we can all talk like this almost instantaneously on Earth. But in space, you're sucking through a straw, like a tiny little straw of data for the most part. NASA's been investing in projects like laser comms, laser relay that can do higher data rates. There's one example of that on the Psyche mission, thankfully, which is continued in this project. But if you don't have a way to send lots of data back quickly, you will not have a way to really communicate, not just communicate, but just health and status of spacecraft, viewing things, just how long it takes to send a picture, right? Or a video of these types of things that we can take for granted. And so you need a robust data relay network at Mars in order to send lots of data back to support your astronauts. And again, this talks about putting a commercially led data relay, um, which is great, I think, in the long term. It doesn't specify what that looks like or what the requirements are. But in the meantime, the only thing we can say is that they are canceling current data relay products in favor of something that doesn't exist and may not exist, again, given the potential short, lifetime of this policy that is being proposed here. So communications, one of those critical, it also does cut back on communications capability and infrastructure at NASA as well, which is, again, one of the many, many, many broader concerns. There's a lot of things that are just asserted in this budget that just say efficiencies will be found with less money. How those are found or what that means is left as an exercise to the reader, probably to NASA itself. But again, this is why it's a budget first policy that there's no considered thinking behind any of this really. It's just fill in the blanks based on what was provided to NASA.
So building off that, how unique is it that the PBR includes such vague language like that, and what you highlighted earlier about we will brief Congress when appropriate
Yeah.
on the future of these programs. How unique is that for this?
That's to me almost unprecedented. I think maybe the closest thing is what we saw was it last year when they said a TBD from our sample return, to be determined.
Yeah.
But there are some serious programmatic issues facing that project. But the degree of hand waving that we've seen in this budget is unprecedented. And I imagine appropriators in Congress are not excited to see that. I heard a friend of ours who was talking to us about this, who was familiar with that process, said, this is free money to me to move around to something else that I care about, right? When you don't explain, I want $350 million to do stuff, um, people aren't going to take that very seriously. If anything else, I mean, besides the critique, it's an example, I think, of the rushed process that this went through, and that this is not, again, the product of a considered policy process, that this is all, in a sense, being provided to NASA with NASA to then fill in the blanks. And it's not, again, how you want to run a national space program. It is again, that's why it ends up being a self-defeating process that is still destructive. Should we do one or two more questions here, Jack? And then
Let's do two more. I'm gonna save as many of these questions as possible. Maybe we can try to address some of them in our follow-up
sure.
communications. Again, we're gonna send an email to everyone that registered for this event with the links to these slides, the recording, all of this. And again, you can reach out to Casey and myself. You can do advocacy@planetary.org, whether it's today, tomorrow, or anytime in the near future that you want to communicate with us. That's the best way to reach us. So, want to talk about one thing that's near and dear to my heart. How did the global petition perform compared to our expectations, and has it been delivered yet? Do you want me to take that one? Great. So the global petition, so we launched just a little bit under a month ago. The first ever, to my understanding, that we have done in the past decade, just a global petition allowing anybody from anywhere around the world to sign a petition to Congress, urging them to reject these cuts. It performed magnificently, better than my expectations. We're zeroing in on 18,000 signatures as of this morning. The deadline for signing that petition is today. This is going to be submitted to the House and Senate Appropriations Committees as part of their outside witness testimony process. Represented of those close to 18,000 people right now includes people from all 50 states, almost every congressional district, and over 100 countries. Now, the breakdown is about 90% of it's coming from the United States, 10% coming globally. But the petition is written in a way to really demonstrate that NASA represents a unique activity within the U.S. government that has a lot of geopolitical weight, has a lot of soft power weight, but also advances our understanding of the cosmos, and advances economic prosperity and technological development here on Earth. So it's been doing magnificently. I'm really looking forward to seeing what that final number is. And I'm actually writing an article for our website, so be on the lookout for some further details about what that included.
Great. What should be our last question, Jack? What do you think?
There's a lot of great questions in
Oh,
here.
here. Oh,
Go ahead.
okay.
If
I'll
you
do
got
two.
one.
One I can answer real quick, so I did want to address this one. Someone that is talking about basically, and I'll summarize this question. Is this a Planetary Society perspective unique, or is this a broader, attitude? So we can talk a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing with partner organizations. So at the Save NASA Science Action Hub, you can see some of the joint letters that we have been putting together with professional societies, professional scientific societies like the American Geophysical Union, the American Astronomical Society. We've had joint letters with Commercial Space Federation, AIA, Mars Society, Explore Mars. We have, lots of broad, public outreach organizations, professional societies, industry associations. This is not a popular budget, right? We do not have a unique dislike of this budget. I think we do have a unique ability to speak honestly and clearly about it, given our independent status. But this is a broadly community rejected position on this. And there's been very little, again, if any effort to positively defend this, which I think is quite telling ultimately, right? So this is, you can, again, if you're part of a member of any of those professional organizations or industry associations, encourage them to continue pushing on this issue. And again, we've had really positive discussions, and we've been very encouraged by the broad range of participation and rejection. Again, from commercial space to scientific societies do not like what we see, particularly when it comes to the cuts to science.
Yeah. So I think a great last question, looking forward into the future, I'm going to merge a couple questions here. The day after the budget request was released, news broke on Semaphore and then confirmed on a number of outlets that Jared Isaacman, the nominee to lead NASA, his nomination was being revoked mere days before the Senate was set to vote on that confirmation. Um, what do we see in terms of timeline for NASA administrator, and what are the problems associated with not having a confirmed administrator as it relates to the budget, but also as it relates to major program decisions, everything from the New Frontiers AO to Roses to MSR to all Nancy Grace Roman telescope. What is this implication of not having confirmed leadership, and what is that timeline that we see?
Oh,
You have
sorry,
some
Jack, I
initial
missed the
thoughts?
last. It dropped for just a second.
You're
What
all
was it?
good.
Say the last question again.
Oh, I mean, what is the implication and timeline that we see for NASA administrator?
Yeah, it's not good. I mean, it was already a very long confirmation process for Jared. One of the longest, right, Jack? You were counting. It was at roughly 6 months from the time he was nominated to when he would have had a vote, a little more than 6 months.
Yeah, 100
Um,
something
so
days.
it could be, I mean, they might nominate someone faster, but then the congressional schedule is not favorable to a rapid confirmation, given, again, this broader budget reconciliation. Congress takes off the month of August functionally to go back home and is not going to be voting on folks. Not to mention, of course, I mean, they have to make it through Senate confirmation. Jared was a good pick in a lot of ways in that he was a moderate. He was not a firebrand politically on any side. He had won over a lot of Democrats, which is, again, not the most common thing in this administration so far, and was probably going to get at least three-quarters Senate confirmation vote. But more importantly, he had to win over the Republicans like Ted Cruz, who are, again, actively rejecting core tenets of this bill. Jared got to be under confirmation while before this bill came out and was able to basically agree with Ted Cruz in various ways. But now the next administrator will have to defend, or whoever the nominee is, will have to defend what's in this bill. And even taking the literal motivations for pulling Jared's nomination is that he wasn't aligned enough with the president. So that's going to be a tough haul. And I could easily see NASA not having an administrator for a very long time. Will that happen? We don't know. It depends who that nominee is. But in the meantime, there's no one there to advocate internally at the White House for NASA. There's no one to go sell, again, these ideas. So again, going back to this non-strategic, unstrategic aspect, there's no one, for one of the most radical budgets in NASA history, you do not have someone going to Congress to try to sell it. At least, who's empowered with that perspective. So it's a very bad place for NASA to be for many reasons. But again, it's a bad place for the administration to be for its own priorities in this. And it will do them no favors in the long run. And so, not to mention, I'd say that, and the last aspect of this to worry about is that the next nominee will be seen through this lens of having to be a much more, let's say, strongly aligned to the president and less independent than maybe Jared was perceived as. And so that will not win many favors for that person, and whether it's deserved or not, that will be the context in which they're seen in. So it will be a tough nomination for them.
Yeah, and it's a very slim majority in both the House and the Senate that the House doesn't have a say in confirmations. But on things like the budget, or the annual appropriation, um, on all of these issues, it is going to require bipartisan support to be able to get through.
Yeah.
Whether that is a full year continuing resolution or even a partial year continuing resolution, full year appropriations, confirmation of a NASA administrator. So the whole political alignment right now is fraught with potential pitfalls. And yeah, we currently do not have a name. I don't want to feed the rumor mill as to some of the names that we've seen on social media of people that might be considered to be NASA administrator, but the search is apparently ongoing, being led by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which I do also believe is kind of a departure from previous consideration of administration nominees, it being led by someone who is notionally involved with the Department of Defense. Um, so we'll have to wait and see when it comes to the next NASA administrator. But in the meantime, comparing this to just the last two administrators where we had former members of Congress serve in that role who knew the Hill like the back of their hand, who knew the players to talk to, who were able to build those inroads and leverage the connections that they made while in their time in Congress. This is a very stark departure in the amount of information that is being provided to members of Congress. We've heard privately number of complaints about the lack of information, even in briefings to committee and member office staff, in the amount of information NASA has been able to provide them, not even just on the budget, but more broadly in terms of the policies being implemented by the administration. So it's creating a situation where not only is there political division in the Congress, creating gridlock, but there is also this sort of consternation that is growing between the legislative branch and the executive branch on issues of space policy, but issues across the board.
Yep. Jack, to close out, do you mind bringing up our slide deck one more time here, just to emphasize? First of all, I want to thank you all for joining us. We had a really amazing turnout today. And again, I'll just emphasize this was Jack texted me, I think, around this time yesterday, saying that we should take this opportunity to provide information on what we know, and to share our insight and our analysis on the NASA budget. And I appreciate you all tuning in and giving us the opportunity to share our perspective on this. Again, a lot of this data, we will send out this slide deck. We will send out this recording. If you've registered for this, we'll email you with it. And a lot of this information is already up on our Save NASA Science Hub. Jack, if you can pull that up when you have a sec, just a reminder for that on the slide deck.
Yeah, Firefox is giving me some fits right now.
Okay.
So we'll see if I'm able to pull up that slide.
In that slide deck, there is one more slide that I'll just mention here at the end, which is a Pew Research poll from 2023, the most recent one that they've done, but consistent with other ones from Morning Consult and on prior Pew Research polls that ask the public what they believe NASA's priorities should be. And I bring this up because someone mentioned about this recent poll about, a lot of people thinking that they should cut NASA's budget if they had to cut something. I have a lot of issues with that poll in terms of how it was phrased. And if you look at how it was phrased about it saying, in order to reduce the national debt, would you cut X, Y, or Z federal agencies? And NASA was one of the top, if not the top on that list. But the situation, that's actually not what we're being proposed here. If that had been entitled, do you want to cut NASA and still increase the national debt? I argue that that would have been a very different poll result. And what is happening now is in this broader context, the budget reconciliation moving through Congress has been targeted at costing on the order of $3 trillion of new debt. So if this was a situation where every agency was being told to cut back in order to reduce the deficit, in order to reduce the debt, that would be one conversation to have. That is not the situation we find ourselves in. And in the meantime, what we do know from public polling is that what people do care about from NASA is NASA science. And the poll that is in the slide deck that we will send out, and including the link, shows that NASA, when asked, the public puts climate, space science, and planetary defense as the top three activities that NASA should do. Unfortunately, they also consider sending humans to Moon and Mars as the lowest priority, which I don't agree with. But as a consequence, we know that the public expects this from NASA. And if nothing else, if NASA pulls away from doing the things that the public expects it to do, NASA being among the most popular federal agencies in government, I think has a longer term risk of alienating public support from our space program. And again, NASA is one of the few agencies in the government that sells, or it doesn't sell, but people buy T-shirts of its logo on the gap. I always point out you don't see a lot of Department of Interior logos in people's T-shirts. It's NASA logos. And that's because what NASA does aims to represent national interest and the public itself. So the fact that we are looking at very devastating cuts to NASA science is actually not just a threat to the scientists themselves. I think it's a threat to public perception of NASA and what they expect NASA to do. So we should not be shy about supporting NASA science. The public expects this to occur and wants it to occur. in addition to the other things that NASA can do that should be uniting activities like sending humans to the moon and Mars, like building these coalitions of our international and commercial partners. These are all things that can be done and has been done by this president in the past. And so what we want to see ultimately is an opportunity here to reset and move on from this ill-conceived budget and pursue a NASA budget and policy that returns to the values of the first administration, first Trump administration, of building this consensus and bringing this as a rare spot and a precious spot of unity for the country and more broadly for the world, which it has huge opportunity to do, as we all know. So I hope you'll join us in this effort. Again, planetary.org has a lot of these links, data, charts. We're trying to put a lot out there, show our work on all this so you can do the best you all can to spread this around to your communities, to bring it to your organizations, to bring it to your representatives. This is the time to do something. This is not the time to sit and wait. This is the time to act. So, Jack, anything else you want to add to this beyond thanking everyone for attending?
Nope, I'm just incredibly grateful for everyone who took the time this morning, or afternoon for those of you on the East Coast, for being part of this. It's an all hands effort, and I look forward to working with every single one of you on improving the future of NASA and the future of NASA science. So I'll see you on the Hill, or online sometime in the future. So I guess we can sign off there, and yeah, we'll follow up with an email with
We'll
a bunch
follow
of
up with
other.
emails. Again, data online, and feel free to email us, contact us for questions. We're easy to find online, and we are happy to help. And if your organization, again, wants directions, ideas, data, let us know, and we will do the best we can to provide that or to give you to somebody who can. So again, thank you all for tuning in, and I hope to speak to you all in happier times with more optimistic news. But again, this is important, and we are happy for the opportunity to share it with you. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.